happy to welcome you all here for our third presentation in this series. Very happy to welcome Dr. Shannen Dee Williams from Dayton. My name is Mark Mann. I'm the program director here for the Catholic Information Center. The ministry of the center creates spaces for encounter, dialogue, and community at the intersection of faith and life. And we're a ministry of the Paulist Fathers. I also want to just lastly take an opportunity to thank everyone for your contributions to the series, but we're especially grateful to the Paulist Mission Advancement Office for the grant that they provided in support of this series. As we continue, let's do so in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God of love and mercy, you call us to be your people. You gift us with your abundant grace. Make us a holy people, radiating the fullness of your love. Form us into a community of people who care, expressing your compassion. Remind us day after day of our baptismal call to serve with joy and courage. Teach us how to grow in wisdom and joy in your presence. Through Jesus and in your Spirit, we make this prayer. Amen. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. As I said, this evening is the third in a series of 4 presentations, and it presents us with an opportunity to explore the proposals in the final document of the Synod on Synodality, which the church is actually still participating in. I know at the cathedral, y'all had participated pretty actively with listening sessions and forming some your own final document. Now we have an international final document, and in paragraph 60, the people that contributed to the final document, not just bishops, but lay people as well, men and women, stated that as a church, we need to acknowledge and celebrate women's past and present contributions. We need greater inclusion of female saints, theologians, and mystics in our not just teaching and catechesis, but also in our preaching. And we want to see the full implementation of existing opportunities for women's roles in the church and explore the other opportunities that have potential for women's contributions. We've invited Dr. Williams here to introduce to us 3 to 4 women, highlighting the historical context and gifts that they expressed through their leadership, gifts that are still needed today. Our hope is that you'll stop and have a moment of recognition. This is my foremother in faith. I have her creativity. I have her generosity. I have her gift of teaching. Of course, with this comes many more questions. We hope curiosity. We hope the desire to talk about it in more detail. And that's the intention of the wisdom circles that we've been offering 2 weeks following each presentation. It's a facilitated space to bring our curiosities, our questions, our insights, and our wonderings, and to do it with others in community. Remembering the story of these women help us to name our own sense of place, our own place in community, and in the continuity of faith-filled followers. We garner a deeper sense of gratitude for these women because we come to recognize that we indeed stand on their shoulders. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Shannen Dee Williams, who's an associate professor of history at the University of Dayton. She's an award-winning scholar of African-American experience and Black Catholicism with research and teaching specializing in women's, religious, and Black freedom movement history. Dr. Williams holds a BA in history with a magna cum laude and a Phi Beta Kappa honors from Agnes Scott College, a master's in Afro studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and her Ph.D. in history from Rutgers University. A lifelong Catholic, Dr. Williams authored the award-winning column, if I pronounce this correctly, you'll have to Griot, the Griot's Cross for the Catholic News Service from 2020 to 2022. Please help me welcome Dr. Shannen Dee Williams.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. Can everyone hear me? Perfect, great. First, I want to thank the Diocese of Grand Rapids, to thank Mr. Mark Mann, the Paulist Fathers, and the Catholic Information Center for inviting me here to share a bit of my own research on Black Catholic women and specifically Black Catholic sisters. I will frame my presentation this evening through the lives and legacies of the 3 African-American sisters currently on the road to sainthood within the Catholic Church. Venerable Mother Mary Lange, who is the foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which is the nation's and the modern world's first Roman Catholic sisterhood freely open to women and girls of African descent. Venerable Henriette DeLille, who is the foundress of the Sisters of the Holy Family, which is the nation's and the modern world's Roman Catholic sisterhood freely open to African descended women and girls. And servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman, who was a pioneer Franciscan sister of perpetual adoration, who championed through her revolutionary ministry of love, the talents of all people, among many other things. But first, I want to begin this evening by acknowledging that November is Black Catholic History Month. I am happy to be here, certainly for so many reasons, but in particular, to celebrate the lives and legacies of Black Catholic sisters because they were the first representatives of the church to teach and to celebrate Black and Black Catholic history within church boundaries. So I first want to begin by sharing with you how I came to study Black Catholic sisters in the church. Although I am Catholic, I knew very little Catholic history outside of my family's own story. Indeed, when I went to graduate school at Rutgers back in 2006, I had no intention of pursuing a topic in Catholic history. Instead, I was writing on or looking for a topic in African-American women's history in hopes of impressing my professor, who was one of the pioneers of the field. And so I had actually began going through old microfilmed editions of African-American owned newspapers, looking for a story that would jump out at me. So in many ways, my first book project, Subversive Habits, which writes the first history of Black Catholic nuns in the United States, began as an attempt to make sense of what I consider to be an extraordinary news story and photograph that I stumbled upon during my first year of graduate school. Again, I was perusing through microfilm editions of Black-owned newspapers in search of a little-known dimension of the American past. And while scanning through a roll of the Pittsburgh Courier, I encountered a 1968 article announcing the formation of a federation of Catholic nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference. The article's title alone, Black Sisters Weigh Contradictions in Christian and Secular Community, immediately piqued my interest. However, it was this accompanying photograph of 4 smiling African-American nuns that steadied my hand on the microfilm reader that day. Up until that moment, I, a lifelong Catholic, had never seen a Black nun except in a Hollywood film. In fact, the only Catholic sister, Black sister that I knew at the time was Sister Mary Clarence, the fictional character played by Whoopi Goldberg in the critically acclaimed Sister Act film franchise. Deeply ashamed of my ignorance, I soon learned that I was not alone. Even my mother, who had attended Catholic schools for the entirety of her formal education, and who in 1974 became one of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, was unaware of the existence of Black nuns in our church. No, only white nuns taught us in our schools, my mother relayed to me on the telephone later that evening. But I wish I had known. I wish we'd had Black nuns in Savannah when I was growing up. Stunned by my mother's revelation, I set out to learn as much as I could about the National Black Sisters Conference and to understand the roots of the invisibility of Black Catholic sisters in our lives. From Father Cyprian Davis's landmark study of the U.S. Black Catholic community, I discovered among many things that there had been Black nuns in my mother's hometown of Savannah, Georgia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before anti-Black prejudice and violent threats pushed these consecrated women out, members of 2 all-Black sisterhoods had helped to lay the foundation for and ensure the survival of the city's Black Catholic educational system. Their efforts made my mother's, and by extension, my own journey into Catholicism possible. Yet the white sisters and priests who taught my mother and hundreds of other Black children in Savannah during America's civil rights and Black Power years never once alluded to Black sisters in their lessons. According to my mother, her white instructors did not teach any Black history or art either. And after calling and writing a host of Catholic institutions to track down some of the sisters and ex-sisters who established the National Black Sisters Conference, I finally began to understand why. The saga of America's Black women who dared to be poor, chaste, and obedient is largely untold, wrote Sister Mary Shawn Copeland in 1975. It is an uneasy story, not only because it is rooted in the American dilemma, racism, but also because the position of woman in an oppressed group is traditionally delicate and strategic. Now, by the time that I interviewed her, Dr. Copeland was a distinguished professor at Boston College and the first Black president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. She had also been out of religious life for 13 years. In the 1960s and 1970s, however, Copeland, who was the first African-American Felician sister in Detroit, Michigan, and later an Adrian Dominican sister, had been one of the conference's most visible leaders. She had also done more than anyone else to preserve the organization's memory in the face of marginalization and erasure. In addition to publishing the first scholarly article on the National Black Sisters Conference, Dr. Copeland in the early 2000s had helped to arrange for the deposit of the organization's papers at Marquette University. "I'm so glad you're interested in the Black Sisters Conference," she expressed to me during our first conversation. "We've been waiting on someone to tell this story." Now, while Dr. Copeland's willingness to share her experiences with me proved pivotal, it was Dr. Patricia Gray, the conference's founding president and one of the 4 nuns featured in that Pittsburgh Courier photograph, who radically changed my book's focus. Routinely described by her female and male peers as one of the most intellectually talented and charismatic Catholic sisters of her generation, Gray, who was known in religious life as Sister M. Martin de Porres, had been the conference's heart and soul in its formative years. As Pittsburgh's first Black religious sister of mercy and the conference's leading public voice, Gray was also the face and force of what some were calling in the 1960s and 70s the new Black nun. However, in 1974, Dr. Gray abruptly departed religious life and stopped giving interviews related to the conference. In fact, when I began trying to track her down, most people told me that I probably wouldn't be able to get an interview with her, that she had in fact turned down the producers of the film documentary Eyes on the Prize, and if she said no to them, how would I get the interview? But I am persistent. "I don't like to look back," Dr. Gray frequently repeated during the first of our many conversations over the years. However, after I presented her with a recently published book on Catholic sisters' activism in the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s and 1970s, she quickly changed her mind. Visibly frustrated by the book's erasure of Black sister vanguard activism in the Catholic fight for racial justice, its cursory mention of the history of racial segregation and discrimination and exclusion within female religious life, and its glaring omissions about the one Black nun who was briefly discussed in its pages, the then 65-year-old ex-nun quietly stood and departed the room. Several minutes later, Dr. Gray returned with a treasure trove, her personal archive from her time in religious life. In handing over the materials, Dr. Gray revealed that in the 1970s, the conference's executive board had desired to publish a book documenting Black sisters' history in the United States. She also lamented to me about the enduring invisibility of Black Catholic sisters, lives and labors in church and wider American history. Then, in her great wisdom, Dr. Gray gently encouraged me to consider expanding my attention to the mostly unsung and under-researched history of the nation's Black sisterhoods. "We, the National Black Sisters Conference, were not the first Black sisters to revolt in the church," she quietly declared. "If you can, try to tell all of our stories." So in my book, I recover the voices of a group of Black American churchwomen whose lives, labors, and struggles have been systematically ignored, routinely dismissed as insignificant, and too often reduced to myth. For 13 years, I sought the untold stories of the nation's Black Catholic sisters, and I must admit, I found no accounts bearing any resemblance to the fabled Hollywood tale of Sister Mary Clarence. I also failed to encounter Black sisters whose lived experiences confirmed many of the existing narratives of American Catholicism, or the master story of Catholic sisters in the United States. Instead, from a host of widely ignored archival sources, previously sealed church records, out-of-print books, periodicals, and over 150 oral history interviews, I bore witness to a profoundly unfamiliar history that disrupts and revises much of what has been said and written about the U.S. Catholic Church and the place of Black people within it. Because it is impossible to tell Black sisters' stories and narrate their journey in the United States accurately and honestly without confronting the Church's largely unacknowledged and unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation, I address these violent systems of power and their perpetrators, male and female, directly. And in so doing, this book recovers an overlooked chapter in the long African-American freedom struggle, a tradition of sustained Black Catholic resistance to racial segregation and exclusion that most scholars argue does not exist. When confronted with the silence past, The greatest responsibility of the historian and the most radical thing any person can do is to tell the story that was never meant to be told. So Subversive Habits marks a new starting point in historical truth-telling in the Catholic Church and in wider American society. For far too long, scholars of the American Catholic and Black past have unconsciously or consciously declared, by virtue of misrepresentation, marginalization, and outright erasure, that the history of Black Catholic nuns does not matter. So in offering the first full survey of Black sisters' lives and struggles in the United States, my book unequivocally demonstrates that their history does matter and has always mattered. And indeed, Subversive Habits in many ways is a tribute to the work of the National Black Sisters Conference. I completed the book that they wanted to start in the 1970s. And so in telling that story, specifically through the lives of the 3 African-American sisters on the road to sainthood, I can tell the story of the entire, or give you an introduction to the entire experience of Black female religious life in the United States. First and foremost, a miracle took place in the 19th century. The United States became home to the modern world's first Roman Catholic sisterhoods freely open to African-descended women and girls. If we look at the story of the transatlantic slave trade, in which the Catholic Church played a defining and leading role, the first order should have ended up in Latin America, where the Black Catholic population is larger than the United States. The largest Black Catholic population as a result of the transatlantic slave trade ended up in Brazil. Brazil will not get its first Roman Catholic sisterhoods freely open to African-descended women and girls until 1928. The Oblate Sisters of Providence are founded in 1828 in Baltimore, Maryland, so almost a century before. So something remarkable happens in the United States, despite the fact of the relatively small African-American Catholic population. But what's important to remember is that the African-American Catholic experience is as old as the European Catholic experience in what becomes the United States. Remember that the church begins not right in 1619 in Virginia in the story of slavery, not there in Virginia, but that story begins in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565. That is where slavery begins formally within the United States, and it begins under Catholic auspices. That's also the site of the first Christian marriage that takes place in the land area that becomes the United States. And it's an interracial marriage between a free Black Catholic woman from Seville, Spain, named Luisa de Abrega, and a Spanish conquistador named Miguel Rodriguez. So what's important to remember is that so much of early African-American history takes place within Catholic boundaries. Catholicism is the first Black articulation of Christianity in what becomes the United States. And if we look at the origins of the Catholic Church in the United States, their Southern origins, and where the church is, you will see long-standing populations of Black Catholics. That means those origins are in Florida, they are in Maryland, they are in Louisiana, they are in Missouri, and they are in Kentucky. And this is where we're going to see the origins of Black female religious life. 8 known historically Black Roman Catholic sisterhoods founded in the United States, all were founded in the South, and they were in sort of hubs of American Catholicism. I will only focus on the 3. 3 of the communities are still with us, but in talking about these communities, they are all interconnected. So I get to tell those stories, which is why these canonization causes are so important. It is impossible to tell their stories without also bringing in the stories of all other sisters. And because the vast majority of Black women who entered religious life entered into either the Oblate Sisters of Providence or the Sisters of the Holy Family, we collect most of those stories. That indeed, of Black women who we know entered religious life in the United States, over 75% of them entered the historically Black orders, which are founded specifically in response to the anti-Black exclusionary policies of European and white American communities. It's important to understand that African-American orders never have those exclusionary policies like their white counterparts. They are produced in response to those exclusionary admissions policies. So beginning with Venerable Mother Mary Lange, Elizabeth Clarice Lange, what's important about the historically Black orders in the United States is that they are always multiracial and multi-ethnic communities. They are not only preserving the vocations of Black women who are rejected admission into white and European American communities across the United States, but they are also preserving the vocations of Black women who are rejected admission into communities in Latin America and the Caribbean as well. In the case of Mother Lange and the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they are born of the Haitian Revolution. During the Haitian Revolution, literally thousands upon thousands of free and enslaved African-descended people began immigrating into the United States, into the port cities, And of course, this creates a humanitarian crisis, in part because you have people who are refugees, most of whom are Catholic, and yet they are coming up against the wall of segregation in their church in the United States. Those lines are more rigid than they are in sort of the French Caribbean and those slave colonies. In the case of Mother Lange, what we know from the historical record is that she herself and several friends start a school. They feel called to religious life. It's in the record in the diaries of the community. We know that the good work that they are doing, because African-American Catholics, these French-speaking Catholics, are being cut off from the church. They themselves begin to found the ministry, serving as godparents to both free and enslaved children, and found a school. Their work becomes known to a young priest who is called to serve in the Black community in Baltimore. What we know is that he meets them, and he writes in his diary soon thereafter that he learns of the work that they are doing, and they express to him that they had also felt a call to religious life. He wrote, quote, that for more than 10 years they had wished to consecrate themselves to God for this good work, waiting patiently that in his own infinite goodness, he would show them a way of giving themselves to him. So 10 years prior to him meeting them, they had felt called to religious life, and they are being rejected. So this is the Diocese of Baltimore, which is the nation's oldest diocese. The record does not tell us what communities reject them, but there are only 3 communities that precede the Oblate Sisters of Providence in the Diocese of Baltimore. They are the Daughters of Charity, founded by St. Elizabeth Seton, the Visitation Sisters, and the Carmelite Sisters, which are all slaveholding communities. What's also important to remember too is that although the Oblate Sisters of Providence are they're the 4th community in Baltimore, in the Diocese of Baltimore, one of the earliest in the United States, and they are the first successful organized community. Those sisters who are able to profess their vows with the Oblate Sisters of Providence are not the first African descended women who are living in the United States who feel called to religious life. We have earlier examples of African descended women who are being rejected into earlier communities across the nation. This is St. Rose Philippine Duchenne, who is the foundress of the US branch of the Society of the Sacred Heart. We know that her correspondence from 1819 contains one of the earliest documented African-American requests to enter religious life in the United States. Her community is the first to be established in Missouri. What we know in this particular case is that the bishop from the Louisiana and 2 Floridas has a group of enslaved women, free women who feel called to religious life, but none of the communities in Louisiana will accept them. He's also talking about a group of men of color who also feel called to the priesthood, and hoping that some community outside of Louisiana will accept them. In response, Duchenne is okay with the women coming into the community, although they were to be given sort of be placed at a 3rd rank below sort of their sisters who taught, and then those who did domestic service. So she would admit those Black women, but only at a 3rd class rank. For his part, the Bishop of Louisiana, Bishop Dubourg, advised Duchenne to only consider women of mixed racial heritage, and even then they should be admitted to a sort of some altered profession with a different habit from the converse sisters. So not only be relegated to a 3rd class status within the community, but also be forced to wear a different habit, signifying their inferiority within the community. For the input of her superior back in France, Saint Madeleine Sophie Barras, she also is hesitant, although she does give tacit approval. She writes, quote, "Do not make the foolish mistake of mixing the whites with the Blacks. You will have no more pupils. The same for your novices. No one would join if you were to receive the Black novices. We will see what we can do for them later." Now, even though this is a tacit approval in the 19th century, they will not accept their first African-American member until after World War II. It is a young African-American girl who first desegregates their college and then goes into the community, and she remains until her death. That being said, what we know from the records of the Society of the Sacred Heart, that they are constantly getting so many applications. They are a slave-holding community. They hold over 150 people in slavery. And we know that among those that are asking to go into the community, at least one is a slave of the community, and her name is Eliza Nesbitt. This is Eliza. She is actually buried with the sisters in Louisiana. Although she is never allowed to join the community, she always assisted their community, and they let her take unofficial vows with the community, and they do grant her request to be buried with the sisters. What is also remarkable in the letters is that we know, because the Society of the Sacred Heart have schools, segregated schools for Black girls and free and enslaved, some of the earliest members of the Sisters of the Holy Family in Louisiana had been taught by the Society of the Sacred Heart and thus had been taught by Eliza Nesbith. So when she's on her deathbed, the sisters note that the Holy Family sisters come from New Orleans and care for her at the very end. So a reminder of these lost vocations. What we also know is that the Society of the Sacred Heart are getting so many vocations that they're considering to found a separate auxiliary branch, just to give us a sense of how many vocations are being lost during this time. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, because they win a champion and a French priest who is willing to support them, they are able to found their own community. And because there is such a large Black refugee population, the church's hand is forced because they are excluded from other institutions. They need people to serve this community, and you have this group of free Black women who are willing to serve their own community. That does not mean that they do not face opposition. Father James Jobert documents it extensively in his own diary. He himself talks about having to arm himself to protect the sisters from people who resent the presence of Black nuns in Baltimore. He also documents the disapproval even from the members of the clergy. He wrote, quote, "I knew already that many persons who had approved the idea of a school for pupils disapproved very strongly that of forming a religious house, and could not think of the idea of seeing these poor girls, colored girls, wearing the religious habit and constituting a religious community." Despite this opposition, they will survive. What I also want to underscore is that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are not a slaveholding community. They have the opportunity to do so. They are not a slaveholding community. They make the decision not to be. And so they provide the counter narrative and the counterpoint to anyone who says that people who owned slaves in that time were simply people of those times. It's a reminder that the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also people of those times, and they choose not to hold people in slavery. What's also remarkable about the Oblate Sisters of Providence is that they are the first U.S. Catholic sisterhood to reject the racist and sexist notion that a woman born into slavery lacked the virtue necessary to enter into religious life. So before the federal abolition of slavery in 1865 with the 13th Amendment, they will accept at least 8 women who were born into slavery into their ranks. And they have the manumission papers for all of those sisters. So this is one of their sisters who was born into slavery and who entered before the Civil War. This is Oblate Sister of Providence, Marie, who was born Ellen Joseph West. What's remarkable about her story is that we know a lot about her because at the turn of the 20th century, she is believed to be the oldest sister in the United States. And so the New York Times and the Washington Post all do stories about her. So we have her story. In certain cases as well, as I said, in the archive to the day, any woman who was born into slavery and decided to enter religious life always brought her manumission papers, even after the federal abolition of slavery, because they were not sure that slavery wouldn't come back. And so they always wanted to have their papers with them. What's also remarkable in the archives of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, at least one woman was still enslaved when they accepted her. The sisters had educated her because they educated both free and enslaved children. And they admit her, and somehow they're able to secure her manumission before they allow her to profess vows. And so, yes. What is the name of it? The manumission records. So if somebody is freed from slavery, you have to have a certificate proving your freedom. In most of the cases, these women are born to enslaved mothers and free fathers. And so oftentimes what happens is these men will send their children, and they're doing it from not just the United States, but Latin America, and sending their children to their boarding academy in Baltimore. And in some of these cases, these women gain their freedom joining the community. I also want to mention one early Oblate Sister of Providence. You may recognize her name. It has come back to us in recent years as a part of Georgetown University's ongoing effort to make reparation for their slaveholding past. As one act of reparation, the university decided to name several halls that had been named after some priests who were involved in a very infamous sale of several enslaved people to secure the financial future of Georgetown. And students went into the archives and they came up with some names and voted on a name. And they found the name of Anne Marie Beecraft, who was a young Black Catholic girl born in 1805 in the Georgetown community, who, when she was just 15 years old, founded the first Catholic school for Black girls in the nation. What's remarkable about Anne Marie Beecraft, who becomes an early Oblate Sister of Providence, is that what we know from the historical record, her father, William B. Craft, is reportedly the natural born son of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who is the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, who was one of Maryland's largest enslavers, who was also cousin to Bishop John Carroll, who was the nation's first Catholic bishop. John Carroll is also the first president. And so what we know from the historical record, Maria Beecraft is considered to be, quote, the most remarkable colored young woman of her time in the district and perhaps of any time. They note her piety, they talk about her remarkable beauty, but also noting, right, that in the midst of the slaveholding of Washington, D.C., her school is located right across the street from the Visitation School, where more than 80 people who are enslaved by the Visitation Sisters labor against their will, and right around the corner from Georgetown, where over 300 people labor against their will. And yet she gets sort of the support of these individuals, and she keeps the school for free Black girls. And we have to ask ourselves, how did she have this influence? And it's simply because she's a Carroll. It's the one thing that she has, and she has blood right. She is the only Catholic sister that we have documented who has a literal birthright and blood right to the nation, because she is a granddaughter of Charles Carroll of Carrollton. The only Catholic sister who we know has a birthright to the early nation and the early church that comes through the Carroll family. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence as well, they found the nation's first and still standing oldest surviving Catholic school, St. Francis Academy. You may sort of know it. In the case of Angel Reese, who plays for the WNBA Chicago Sky, she comes out of St. Francis Academy, and she talks about St. Francis a lot. What's also important with the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the network that they develop, in addition to their schools, the Oblates will also give rise to 3 additional communities of sisters. I do want to briefly mention the first community that is born of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They are the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the IHM Sisters, who are the first Roman Catholic sisterhood to be established in Michigan. Their foundress, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, is also a foundress of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. She began as an Oblate Sister of Providence. If you don't know that story, in 1845, Father James Jobert, the priest founder of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, dies. And in response, the Bishop of Baltimore, who has never wanted Black nuns in his diocese, decides to completely suppress the community, denying priests the right to give them communion, hopes that they would simply, as he stated, go back into the world and be maids. They are saved when a Belgian priest steps in, prostrates himself before the bishop, and begs for the community's survival. They will survive, but in that chaos, Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, who was a former foundress of the community, one of their earliest students, decides with 2 other members to go found another community. They find a Redemptorist priest who is beginning a ministry in Michigan. And once they get to Michigan, they get to Monroe, it becomes very clear that they can only found a community for white women. In the case of Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin, she is the product of a mother who is from Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, and a British admiral father. We don't know the circumstances of that relationship, but it produced a child. She and another woman, member of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, are light enough to pass for white. And so they tell the 3rd member not to come because she's too dark and she will reveal them. And so they found the Sister Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Michigan, establishing female religious life in the Roman Catholic tradition in the state of Michigan. What's also very clear is that Mother Teresa Maxis Duchemin is extremely talented. The IHM Sisters are a distinguished community, have a distinguished networks of academies for girls, and also have an established 3 Catholic universities. The community begins to grow very quickly, and Mother Teresa is so efficient, she decides to expand the community into first Western Pennsylvania and then into Eastern Pennsylvania. If you know sort of the story, what we know is that she becomes a bit too independent, the records say, for the bishops. She gets into a lot of trouble, and the bishops, who are the only ones who know her secret, refer to her in racially derogatory ways. They sort of refer to her as a cunning mulatto and all sorts of things. So in order to save her community, she decides to relinquish power, and she goes into exile with the nuns, the Grey Nuns of Ottawa, Canada, for almost 20 years. When she's very old, she's allowed to come back into the United States, and she's buried in Pennsylvania with her community. However, after she dies, the community sort of colludes with one another to not acknowledge their African-American heritage. They do not cite Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin and Anne Constance Schaef, who was the other Oblate Sister of Providence, as their foundresses. Instead, they begin to write books that say that their third member was their foundress. We also know that for several decades, they closed access to their archives because anyone who went into their archives would have known about their African-American heritage. They have since apologized, opened their archives, adopted an anti-racist platform. They go through a reunion celebration with the Oblate Sisters of Providence every 3 years. It's a really important story of sort of reconciliation and reparation. What's remarkable, though, is in my book, I include a photograph, the only known photograph that exists of Mother Teresa Max's Duchemin. This had not been made available. If you go to any sort of website, what you will see is an etching based on this photograph. And I should have put that photograph in there as well. But what I want to note, if you do know the IHM sisters and you remember their original habit, the only photograph of their foundress is not one where she's wearing the original habit of the community. This is not the habit of the IHM sisters. This is the habit of the Grey Nuns of Ottawa. It's why the photograph is so uneasy, right? Because it documents her exile. And so what they did is created an etching based on this photograph where they imposed the IHM habit on her. But this is the photograph that they have of her that's in the archive in Monroe. The Oblate Sisters of Providence will also give rise to the third African-American sisterhood that is still with us, the Franciscan Handmaids of the Most Pure Heart of Mary. One of their members went down to Savannah to found a community after a law that was introduced in the Georgia State Legislature, which would have barred white teachers from teaching Black children and Black teachers from teaching white children. And had it passed, it would have barred Black children from the Catholic educational system because there were no Black nuns in Savannah at that time, and they weren't going to let white nuns teach Black children. And so they had to get down to Savannah and try to save the community there. These are the Oblates. For a very long time, they were the largest community of Black sisters in the United States and in the world. In the United States, they would be overtaken by the second successful community of sisters, the Sisters of the Holy Family, in the early 1960s. The Sisters of the Holy Family, founded by Venerable Henriette DeLille, are established in 1842 in New Orleans, Louisiana. What's notable about this community is that they are the first community to be a Catholic sisterhood to be established in the state of Louisiana. Now, to be clear, there are other Catholic sisterhoods that are already ministering in Louisiana, but all of them had been founded in Europe and primarily in France. This is the community that is the first to be established in the state of Louisiana. And they're established, like the Oblate Sisters of Providence in Baltimore, in response to the anti-Black admissions policies of the communities that are already predating them in Louisiana. What's notable about this community is that this is where we get the first real sort of documented evidence of Black women's calls to religious life, but also their desires to protect themselves from the realities of slavery and what would protect them in this situation in the Louisiana territory from this system of concubinage that was known as plissage, where European men took women of color as basically their common law wives, which these women recognized as a form of sexual exploitation. Most of these women themselves were direct products of that system, and so they spoke to it firsthand. What's notable about the Sisters of the Holy Family, the only image that we have of their foundress, Venerable Henriette DeLille, you'll notice that she's not wearing a veil. So for the first several decades of their existence, they were not allowed to wear habits. That was denied to them solely on the basis of their color. But what we know about these women is that they all come from an elite background. Henriette DeLille herself is the great-great-granddaughter of Claude de Griot, who is the inaugural French royal engineer whose crews of free and enslaved men built the first roads, the first canals, the first levees in New Orleans. They also built the old Ursuline convent, which ironically Henriette DeLille would never be able to enter because of her African heritage and her unwillingness to pass for white. Many of the earliest sisters were also from the earliest sort of founding families of Louisiana, French, Spanish, and German. Their first historian, Sister Mary Bernard Deggs, sort of tells us very clearly that all of the first sisters were of the very first families of the city, and only one, Sister Suzanne Navarre, was a stranger from Boston. As for the rest, they were all natives of this state, but their fathers were all foreigners, some French, Spanish, or German. They were descended from the first settlers of Louisiana. And as I said before, all of these African-American communities are multilingual. The sisters are multilingual. They're always speaking English, Spanish, and French, the languages of colonization. And in the case of one of their founding members, her father was German, and so she also spoke German. They also talk about the hardships that they face, noting, quote, that we had a very hard time, for we had many enemies who wanted to degrade our dear little community as poor as we were. We were persecuted by the Sisters of St. Joseph in this city. They tried all they could to make us take off our habits. That was after 45 or 50 years that we had worked and suffered to have a religious habit. No one would think we were anything if we were not dressed in the holy habit. In this particular case, the Sisters of St. Joseph, who they're referring to, arrived in New Orleans in 1866, right after the end of the Civil War. And so what we know is that the Sisters of the Holy Family have finally won the right to wear their habits. And when they start wearing their habits in public, people protest. In the case of the Sisters of St. Joseph, they make the argument that the Holy Family habit is too much like their lay sisters, and so they want them to change it. And so in other words, they want the Holy Family sisters to be seen as the lowest rank of sisters in the community, and so they have to change it. In their early habit, what they do is they draw out the four. So you basically would never, if they were walking in the street and you just saw the profile, you would never be able to see their skin, to protect the sisters. Because we do have examples of people throwing things at them, throwing trash at them, and this is true for the oblates as well, trying to rip the habits off of their heads. This is important because now in the contemporary period for the surviving African-American sisters, you will always notice that members of the Black sisterhoods always wear habits. They always wear the veil. They refuse to abandon it with the liberalizing reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And they tell you why. They said because people would not allow us. So that was the one thing that they refused to give up. It's not because they were politically, they were trying to sort of hold on. They were like, we're holding on to the habit because we had to fight so hard for them. Oh, I think I hit something. Uh-oh. Let me go back over. Uh-oh. What do I do? Okay, perfect. One thing that I also want to mention with the Sisters of the Holy Family, one of the first things that they begin to do after the federal abolition of slavery is they begin to buy up properties that were associated with the sins of slavery. So they buy a former slave trader's pen and turn it into one of their earliest schools. And they sort of say, there were the most horrid crimes took place there. So we will turn this and we will expiate the sins and we will redeem these spaces. For a very long time, their mother house, which was located at 717 Orleans Street, was one of the few Black-owned properties in the French Quarter in New Orleans. It was a former quadroon ballroom where women of their color and caste would have been expected to pursue these relationships with these European men, which they called in their first history, they call it a den of sin. And they said, so we will buy this property, and they turned it into their mother house in St. Mary's Academy, which is the second oldest Catholic school, Black Catholic school in the nation, which has been in the news recently. If you were paying attention to the young African-American girls from St. Mary's, they offered a solution to the Pythagorean theorem that they said couldn't be done, that they come out of St. Mary's in their school. And again, the third community that's still with us are the Handmaids of Mary. They are born of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One of their members, Mary Theodore Williams, leaves the Oblates and founds a community in Savannah to make sure that African-American children maintain access to the Catholic educational system. What's remarkable, she's from Baton Rouge. She had been a part of a failed community in Convent, Louisiana, been an Oblate for a while, and then was working as a domestic for the Sisters of Notre Dame in Washington, D.C., before being recruited by a priest to come down in Savannah to preserve African-American access to Catholic education. One thing that I want to note, most people always talk about or note that the handmaid habit is very similar to the oblate habit. And I say, oh, it's actually the same one. So when she left the oblate, she didn't give up her habit. And so when she went to Savannah, she took her habit with us. And that's why people say, oh, well, I tell people it's the same habit. That's what it is. What we know from the historical record is that some of the earliest members come from the Caribbean. There's one woman who is actually a former enslaved person for the Carmelites in Cuba who joins the community. They're founded in Savannah in 1960, and by 1923, they are run out of town due to prejudice, and they settle in Harlem, where they were for the next several decades. Just to note too, because that community does not have a formal archive, the African American press in Savannah, Georgia, is probably the best source for what we have about the Black Catholic community there beyond the Diocese of Savannah. The African-American press always took note of the African-American community. They documented every profession ceremony, so we know these women's names, we know where they come from, which has made doing the genealogical work so much easier for those of us who are interested in these women. So when we think about the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, through the lives and legacies of Venerable Mother Lange and Henriette DeLille, what's remarkable in telling these women's stories is that we get to tell the stories of the women who joined the community. And so many of their stories intersect with so many larger stories of the American experience. So this is one example. This is Oblate Sister of Providence, Sister Mary Gertrude Smallwood. Her father, Joseph P. Smallwood, was a barber, made good fortune for himself in Philadelphia, and then made his way to California in the gold rush. He is also the only Catholic person who we know attends all of the colored Catholic congresses of the 19th century. He is one of the first African Americans to vote in the state of California. He is also responsible for ensuring the integration and that African American students will be able to go to the University of California, Berkeley from the very beginning. An early civil rights activist who is well documented in Black California history. One son became a personal secretary to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Salmon P. Chase. Another son, James Smallwood, founded the first Black school for children in York, Pennsylvania. And then their daughter, Sister Mary Gertrude Smallwood, joined the Oblate Sisters of Providence and became the principal of several of their schools in Louisiana and Missouri. So coming from a distinguished family of African-American pioneers, many of the individuals who joined the Oblate Sisters of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, many African-American women and girls who become sisters in the United States can also trace their lineage to the enslaved people who helped to build the church. These are the famous Wade siblings. Mary Angela and Mary Pius become Oblate Sisters of Providence. They are well known within the community. Mary Angela becomes one of the first Black students at Villanova University, which the Oblate Sisters of Providence desegregate in 1927. Their brother, Francis Wade, is one of the first 4 SVD priests. They also had 2 aunts who were Oblate Sisters of Providence. Their mother's family was born free in Maryland. Their father, the Wades, they were enslaved by the Jesuits in Southern Maryland. They actually have an uncle, if you trace the family, they have an uncle who's Gonzaga Wade, just to sort of, to see how people sort of trace that and where the names pop up. But in the case of their father, his family had been enslaved by the Jesuits, meaning that those aunts who were Oblate Sisters of Providence who preceded them were also enslaved by the Jesuits. Like their white counterparts, African-American Catholics who can trace their lineage to the earliest days of the church will send many of their children into the Catholic Church. They are good Catholics. In many of these cases, this is the story of Black women who entered that entered into Black communities. When I first started doing oral history interviews of older Black sisters, I thought they joined the Black sisterhoods because they had been educated by the Black sisterhoods. And they said, oh, no. I was educated by this white community. They told me that they wouldn't accept me. And I was very lucky. Someone told me about the Black orders. So this is also a story of young Black women and girls traveling hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter religious life and going to a community that's willing to accept them. Such as the case of the famous Burke Sisters of St. Augustine Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Parents are founders of that church. They can trace their lineages to the enslaved people of the Holy Land of Kentucky. They send 5 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence. One daughter becomes very ill, and so she comes back home, but the 4 remaining stay until their deaths, with the last Burke sister dying just a few years ago. And again, they are educated in Kentucky, rejected admission into those communities, and are lucky to be directed to the Oblate Sisters of Providence, where they remain until the rest of their lives. These are the famous Price sisters of Baltimore, Maryland. George and Lillian Price will send 4 of their daughters to the Oblate Sisters of Providence and 1 son who becomes a Josephite, which is a historically English community of priests who come to the United States specifically to serve the African-American community after the Civil War. These are the famous Thomas sisters of Akron, Ohio, by way of Lebanon. Their family come out of Lebanon, which is a part of the Holy Land of Kentucky. Their family was owned by the Spalding family of the church that will give us some of our earliest bishops, in John Lancaster Spalding and Martin Spalding, who was an early Bishop of Baltimore. So they send their three oldest daughters to the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in New York. And the youngest daughter, Josephine, was able to desegregate a white community, the Sisters of St. Joseph of St. Mark in Cleveland, Ohio. The last Thomas sister just passed away about 2 years ago, but there's some of the other siblings who didn't enter religious life who are still alive. What's also remarkable about the women who enter religious life is that we get stories within the church that may otherwise have been lost to us. What's remarkable is, again, some of these young women have stories that intersect with the larger tragedies of what racism was and unfortunately remains to be in the United States. There are some women who are the daughters of lynch victims. One Oblate Sister of Providence, Felix Manzilla, her father was a pioneer African-American educator, was the first African-American graduate of Mount Union College in Ohio. He then becomes the first Black school principal in Dallas, Texas, and then is working as a mathematics professor at Langston College, it's a historically Black college in Oklahoma. Early in the 20th century, he is subjected to a lynching there. After he is lynched, the insurance company refuses to pay out the life insurance policy, pushing the family into abject poverty. His surviving widow, Sister Felix's mother, suffers a nervous breakdown from which she does not recover as a result of this. They are not Catholic. What happens though, in Oklahoma, a white priest who is stationed in Oklahoma knows what happens, takes pity on the kids. And so he takes the children who are then orphaned because their mother has not been able to withstand this trauma. None of the white sisterhoods in Oklahoma will take the children into their orphanages. And so, because of color. And so what this priest does is he takes them to Kansas, where the Oblate Sisters of Providence have orphanages, and they are saved by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. If you go to Sister Felix's file, she documents everything. The priest, what he did, how thankful they were. But even more so than that, if you go to her file, what's in the file is lawsuit after lawsuit. So decades after the father's death, the family was still suing the insurance company for destroying them. They never win, but they at least sort of have this on the record. But when they are saved by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they do become Catholic, and one daughter, Sister Felix, becomes an Oblate Sister of Providence, and she remains an Oblate Sister of Providence to her death, until her death. The records of the Oblate Sisters of Providence also tell us much about what the sisters are doing behind the scenes. The sisters, one of their earliest ministries in St. Louis, Missouri. In 1921, we know that their annals tell us, among many things, is that they took in the survivors of the Tulsa Massacre. So people who were survivors of the Tulsa Massacre from 1921, if they were able to make their way to St. Louis, which many of them did, many of them who had daughters, because their St. Rita's Academy is a boarding academy, they took in the daughters. And what's remarkable in this one sister who is documenting what happens, she says, this was at the time of that dreadful riot in Oklahoma, and our people fled to St. Louis with their children for protection, doctors, lawyers, undertakers, children begging the girls to begging to let the girls with small sisters sleep together, that the children were so traumatized by surviving the massacre. The sisters were like, the parents were begging them, let the younger sisters sleep in the same bed with their older sisters as they sort of process this. What's perhaps even most devastating is that happens in 1921. 1922, when they moved their St. Rita's Academy into an all-white community, their neighbors attacked them. And what they have to do is they have to get white Catholic men, members of the Knights of Columbus, to arm themselves and protect the sisters. They have to take the sisters and the children in 2 by 2. And because they're Black women, they need a white man, right, to speak to the police, because the police will not listen to them. So it's a Knight of Columbus who sort of has to protect them and stops the neighbors from breaking in. But it sort of goes on for years and years. And so the children are traumatized again. But they do not leave. They remain. And part of what they're able to do, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, in order when property, particularly in white communities, they had their attorney who was white buy the property and then turn it over, because laws would have barred them from doing it. But that's how they acquired so much property during that time. And of course, the Oblate Sisters of Providence developed the most expansive network of Black Catholic schools, not simply across the United States, but they also move into the Caribbean and Latin America as well. But again, they are also the first representatives of the church to teach and to celebrate Black history. If you go through their records, the student yearbooks, they are always teaching Black history. And what's really remarkable is that from the very beginning, they also make sure that they are talking about sort of the Black Catholic, the stories in the history of Black Catholics as well. What's also remarkable about this community is that they are the first to begin the desegregation of Catholic higher education. We oftentimes sort of think about this happening really sort of post-World War II, but because Catholic sisters have to get their schools accredited, and because church law basically says that all Catholics must be educated in Catholic schools, they have to reach out to the Vatican. They're saying, our schools may close. What are we to do? You tell us that we have to be educated in Catholic schools, and these Catholic institutions will not accept us even though they were Catholic. And so what we know on the records is that representatives from the Vatican have to come into the United States, identify progressive white people at Catholic colleges and universities, and they have to figure out ways to open up their doors. So history books will tell you that the first Black students entered St. Louis University in St. Louis, a Jesuit institution, in 1944. The Oblate Sisters of Providence was there in 1927. And their first graduate, Sister Mary Loretta Short, who is from Washington, D.C., Eleanor Short, writes her bachelor's thesis on James Weldon Johnson, the Black poet, in 1935. And what's really remarkable is that when you begin to go through the sisters' bachelor's and master's and Ph.D. theses, you sort of see these early Black studies theses, and then it plays out in what they're teaching their students in the classroom, right? In their student newspapers and their student letters, we sort of see how that is impacting the students. And again, making sure that their young people have enough sort of pride within themselves to go out and do what they need to do. It's what the sisters would say, nothing is too good for the youth of our race. And of course, they believe that they have every right to enter Catholic institutions. The Oblate Sisters of Providence integrate Villanova in the 20s, St. Louis University in the 20s, a host of Catholic colleges and universities. They also reintegrate the Catholic University of America. Now, at its founding, the Catholic University of America accepted men. There were no women that were accepted, but men regardless of color. During World War II, a moratorium is placed upon the admission of US-born Black people, accepting Black people born outside of the United States, but not in the United States. It opens back up in 1932, literally with the work and leadership of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They put pressure on the Archbishop of Baltimore, who finally sort of writes in 1932 that I'm afraid we're going very far now, yielding to prejudice when we exclude the colored sisters from the Catholic University. And he's basically writing to the rector there. He was like, you've got to figure out something to do. What's remarkable in the records, though, is that the Oblates say, we will not come to the Catholic University just for ourselves, that if we come and we do a good job, you have to open it up for Black people again. And so, of course, they're going to send their best. They send Sister Mary of Good Counsel Baptiste and Sister Mary Consolata Gibson, both natives of New Orleans. And if you go to their transcripts, they're perfect. So when the sisters sort of select sisters to desegregate institutions, of course, they send the best, but they also send the best and the best who can be great under pressure, who will not break under pressure. And of course, they will send their best. Mary of Good Counsel Baptiste goes on to become one of the earliest Black people, probably the first Black person to get a master's degree from Villanova University. So those are the Black sisterhoods, really sort of the kinds of stories that we can get through the lives and legacies and telling the stories of Venerable Mother Mary Lange and Venerable Henriette DeLille. Now, the last sister is Servant of God, Sister Thea Bowman. Sister Thea Bowman is representative of the generation of African-American women and girls who were able to desegregate the nation's historically white sisterhoods after World War II. She is also a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference. That's her up here. I've circled her or sort of pointed her out at the founding meeting in Pittsburgh in 1968. What's remarkable about this story and what she represents is the reminder that young Black women and girls who desegregated white sisterhoods are also a part of this desegregation movement. The difference is, though, they did so outside of the protection of news cameras. These are young girls who had to go in and write. These are girls that didn't get to go home at night. Sometimes they're hundreds and even 1,000 miles away from home, and they are around the clock. And they are fighting for one of the most ambitious goals of the civil rights movement, and that is to transform the hearts of people, right? To actually sort of believe that you can actually dismantle racism by actually sort of embracing sort of this idea of agape love. And it hurts. And these are painful stories. In the case of Sister Thea Bowman, she goes into community when she's just 15 years old. She is born Bertha Elizabeth Bowman in Yazoo City, Mississippi. Her father was an early African-American physician in Yazoo City, Mississippi. Her mother was a teacher. And then after she gave birth to Thea, she became a homemaker. Her parents were Protestants, but put her into a Catholic school when she was very young, and she converted. And what we know is that from the record is that when Thea decided to go into religious life, she wanted to join the community of her educators. And initially, when her parents said that she couldn't, she went on a hunger strike until they let her do so. She went in at 15. She went into their sort of aspirancy program or aspirancy program in 1953. They note that she was the first Black person to reside in La Crosse, Wisconsin, to their knowledge. She was also their high school's first Black student, the first Black student at their college, Viterbo College, now Viterbo University, the first Black professor at Viterbo, because she goes on to get her Ph.D. in English from the Catholic University of America, where she also teaches the university's first course in African-American literature. And she becomes the first Black department chair at Viterbo. After a career in higher education, she is going to return to Mississippi, where she launches her ministry, celebrating sort of the intellectual and cultural gifts of the African-American community and embracing and celebrating the multiculturalism of the Catholic Church. Her story is important because we also know that Thea suffers. We know that when she first gets there, she is teased about her hair texture. She is teased about always, when she would be happy, she would break out in song and they would tell her, don't do that. We also know that she endured verbal taunts, being called the N-word, being told that she would go to the N-word heaven with the dogs and other animals. We also know that because she knew her parents would come and get her, if they knew that she was being bullied, she sort of endured this. With some of her counterparts, both Black and white, have said that that probably also led to her early death because it cost her something, as it did many pioneering Black priests and sisters in hostile communities. But it also allows us to sort of tell other stories and remind us of that history that's also there behind that fight to integrate religious life and to make the church truly Catholic. What's really remarkable is that communities who are looking to make reparation for their racist past, one of the things that they have been able to do is to release records to also confirm the oral testimonies of Black sisters and Black women who were rejected admission into white communities solely on the base, and who were saying, votes were taken about us. We were bullied. This all happened to us, and yet it's nowhere in the record unless you begin to go through the General Council minutes. These are the Religious Sisters of Mercy. They're minutes from Chicago. Mother Provincial of the province of Chicago, Mother M. Genevieve Crane, reported that she is being faced with the problem of accepting colored girls as postulants. Mother understands that a priest is sending in an application for 2 colored girls to enter the novitiate. The problem was discussed by the General Council, but no action was taken. Mother asked the members of the General Council to give it serious thought and fervent prayer. Now, part of what's remarkable is that many white priests who minister in the African-American community submit the applications themselves because they don't want the girls to experience the rejection. The men want to send the application, and if they get the rejection, he'll just sort of write to another community so the girls don't experience it. And yet some girls do write on their own and they experience it, but we see the men trying to sort of stop this kind of, or at least putting pressure on the communities and forcing them to think the morality and utility of these anti-Black admissions policies. What's remarkable about this here is it documents that Black girls are seen as problems before they ever step foot in the convent, that they were never even given the chance. Another from their records, this is a white priest who ministers in Harlem's Resurrection Church in New York City in the Archdiocese of New York. In 1946, he writes to the superiors of all the communities in New York. And he basically it's just sort of an inquiry letter, but he gets to the meat of it in the second paragraph. And he asks a very pointed question. Is the order Catholic enough to accept colored vocations? I'm in a colored parish and I'm immediately concerned with this information. And the response that he gives back is no, no, no. In the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, they're getting so many applications that they write to the Vatican and they ask for Vatican guidance. So their superior of the union is writing in 1946, enclosed is a copy of a letter I received from one of our mothers, provincial, relative to the acceptance of colored girls to our institute. The problem is forced upon us because of the number of colored students we now teach in our schools. Even though the training of colored subjects would necessarily differ in some respects from the training of other subjects, the colored would no doubt resent a separate novitiate. It seems too at this time that the sisters in general would not welcome colored subjects into our present novitiate. They get so many applications in Chicago that they are encouraged initially to create an all-Negro province. That's how many vocations that they're getting, I mean, applications that they're getting. And so what this tells us is important for many reasons. One, again, it tells us that girls were considered problems before they ever stepped foot in the convent. Two, it reminds us is that just because white teachers teach Black children does not mean that they exhibit a commitment to racial justice or anti-racism. And three, when they admit that anybody who they would admit in would not be welcomed, it's telling us then that anti-Blackness is not seen as grounds for dismissal for white sisters in the community. It's not seen as a problem. Chicago, which it becomes the home to one of the largest Black Catholic communities in the nation, the Religious Sisters of Mercy will never take a sister from Chicago, despite the fact that they had all of those applications. And again, this is also helping us to document how many vocations were lost. Because on the one hand, we sort of have the paper record, the actual sort of copies of the rejections, we have the copies of the votes. But many African-American women that I interviewed said, you know, I didn't even submit a written application. I asked my teacher. I asked the visiting vocation director. So the rejection was oral. So there's no evidence of the rejection. And they were like, you know, and so I didn't even think to go and write to someone else. I was so hurt and I was so ashamed that I didn't want to tell anybody what happened. So in the case of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, their first member who will be accepted and who will remain, who is still with us, Sister Cora Marie Billings, will enter in Philadelphia in 1956. She is also believed to be the first US-born Black woman to enter a congregation in Philadelphia. In her particular case, that story is important. So she had two aunts who were also educated by sisters in Philadelphia who had both been rejected admission into the Religious Sisters of Mercy solely on the basis of race. They become Oblate Sisters of Providence and die as Oblate Sisters of Providence. Their father, Sister Cora Marie's grandfather, John Aloysius Lee Sr., was the second African-American graduate of Philadelphia's Roman Catholic High School, which is the oldest Catholic high school in the nation. He's also the first African-American to ever play in a Catholic basketball league. He was sort of amazing. When a prominent layman built all sort of the segregated sort of Black sports leagues in Philadelphia. There's a recreation park named after him in West Philadelphia. He's also the first African-American to win the Vercelli Medal, which is the highest award for a layperson in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. His father, William Henry Lee, was owned by the Jesuits at Georgetown. And that becomes sort of that story. So when we talk about Sister Thea Bowman's story and those Black women who are desegregating communities, we get remarkable examples. This is Joyce Williams of Chicago by way of Summit, Mississippi, who was denied admission into the Order of St. Benedict in St. Joseph, Minnesota from 1944 to 1948 solely on the basis of race. When she applies for the first time in 1944, they're so impressed with her application that they give her a full ride to their college, but they say that she can't join the community. After she graduates, she applies again, and the sisters say, no, you can't come. There's no work you can do, even though you've gotten a great degree from our university. You're a science teacher and you're teaching in Catholic schools, but you can't join the community. And the superior even writes, well, we wouldn't even know what your people eat, so you can't come. 1949, there's a new superior who is her former dean at the college. And once her dean becomes the leader of the community, she is admitted and she remains until her death. This is her in habit. This is Phyllis Ray Johnson of Detroit, Michigan. Some sisters have to leave the United States to get into communities. She is rejected admission into all the contemplative communities in Michigan in 1948. She's a graduate of Wayne State. She takes 3 years, learns and becomes fluent in French, and then she enters into a Trappistine community in Canada where she remains until her death. This is Sister Daniel Marie Miles. Again, sisters talking about their own experiences and the pain that they suffer. Many of these pioneering sisters are also pioneers in their respective professional fields. This is Dr. Frances Douglas, also Sister Frances Douglas. She's the first African-American daughter of the Heart of Mary. She's also the first African-American to earn a Ph.D. in psychology from Fordham. She's also the first African-American to chair a department at a historically white university in the United States. We thought it was somebody else, but because nobody was paying attention to the Catholic Church, we missed Dr. Douglas. She's the first African-American chair at DePaul University in 1956 and later becomes the first woman of color to chair a department at Marquette University. Because her community does not wear habits, most people didn't know she was a nun. They were sort of, they had to find out about that later. But nonetheless, this is Ann Michael Boyd of Washington, D.C., and leads the Franciscan Sisters of Rice Lake, Wisconsin, becoming the first known self-identified Black woman to lead a U.S. white congregation in the 20th century. She also merged her community with the all-white and historically Polish Sisters of St. Joseph of the Third Order of St. Francis, which is headquartered in Stevens Point, Wisconsin. This is Sister Mary Antona Ebo, who becomes the first Black woman known to lead a U.S. hospital. She is also a pioneering member of the Sisters of St. Mary, who are now the Franciscan Sisters of Mary, and was in that first delegation of Catholic sisters to march in Selma, Alabama in 1965. This is Sister Mary Reginalda Polk. She's an early Black Sisinalawa Dominican and who became the first Black person to lead a Catholic school in Milwaukee in 1967. She is the daughter of Prentice Herman Polk, who was the longtime Tuskegee University professor and photographer, who took a lot of photographs of the great Dr. George Washington Carver, but perhaps is best known for his famous photograph of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Tuskegee pilot and instructor Captain Charles Anderson. This was the photograph that was used to recruit and to promote the Tuskegee Airmen program, if you didn't know. But these connections, many of these women sort of have these very deep connections within the African-American community. And of course, their alumni base is also extremely distinguished. I just want to mention very briefly Judge Arthur McFarland. He's educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence. He talks at length about integrating the Catholic high school in the 60s in Charleston, South Carolina, noting how prepared they were by the Oblate Sisters of Providence themselves, but also talking about the fact that they were members of the AME Church, but his parents were so impressed by the Oblate School Immaculate Conception in Charleston, South Carolina, that they were put in that school. And he was so impressed by the sisters that he converted to Catholicism, and specifically talked about how they used basketball to help facilitate integration. Now, this is an interesting story in terms of how they use basketball. And they talked about how the sisters encouraged them to join the civil rights movement. I was noting that sort of that basketball link, because so many Black men who were educated by the Oblate Sisters of Providence, they talk about sort of the strenuous academics, but they also say that, you know, we were also sort of like basketball champs. We were always basketball champs. We were great. This is one man who said, you know, again, he wasn't, that he didn't convert, but he just talks about the Oblates. By the way, the first person I ever saw do a crossover dribble was Sister Paul. And so he was talking about how distinguished, and he said, if you go through the state records, we were always state champions. And I said, that's an interesting story. And I was like, oh, Sister Paul. So Sister Paul Lee is Sister Cora Marie's aunt, who is the child of John Aloysius Lee, who was the first African-American to play in a Catholic basketball league. And so this is the aunt of Cora Marie, and she talks about, you know, her father was able to break that barrier. And there's a great story about her father. Initially, the other team that was going to play them in the state championship, they weren't going to play because they didn't want to play against a Black person. But all of his white teammates said, well, if he doesn't play, we don't play. So they played and they won. But in her own experience, when she was playing basketball in high school in Philadelphia, she talked about not being allowed to go to away games, and a letter being sent saying that no Negroes are allowed, even as spectators, in our gymnasium. And she remembered that none of her classmates sort of stood up for her the way in which her father's classmates did. So this is her father as a young man. And so his teammates had stood up for him, and yet she experienced that rejection. And yet she did not allow that to sort of poison her. Instead, she built a very, very powerful basketball tradition at the Oblate schools, which is still with us if we go all the way back to, if we go now to Angel Reese. This is the recreation center named after her father and all of what he did in Philadelphia. And I say this too when we think about the legacy of these women. There are so many people who are still out there, even as the sisters' numbers decline, who reached out to me over the years, making sure that they could tell me the story of their sister in their life. One woman reached out to me on social media asking if the Oblate Sisters of Providence would be included in my book, and she said, fantastic. My former teacher and the most wonderful person in the world, Sister Emily Burke, was a member of that order. And so that is the order, the sisters that come out of Kentucky that were rejected and then went on to Oblate, and then taught in many of their schools across the nation. People reached out to me, oh yes, my aunt was a sister. I don't know if you came or ran into her story, but I can give you so much information. One social worker sort of reached out to me, noting that in the 1990s, she had a pleasure with working with an oblate who was volunteering at a small group home for children who were born with HIV. This was at the time in which the AIDS was feared, so the good work of Mother Lange continues. And she couldn't remember the name. I think she's like, oh, I think it's maybe Sister Mary Vianney. She was a retired school principal, and yes, she got the name right. And in the file was all of this work. They said that she was just so dedicated, they would have to sort of send cabs for her because she would be there all night, sort of sitting with the children. Some people said, yeah, you know, I found the name of my teacher in your book. I don't know if you have any information about her. If you want to see her handwriting, it's there. I have my old report cards for you. And even still, even as the book has come out, there were some sisters that I couldn't find, but since the book has come out, priests have reached out to me, sisters who are sisters and former sisters that were in their parishes who had passed on nonetheless. I found out stories of sisters that I had sort of come across, but I'd never been able to track down. One priest in St. Paul, Michigan, sort of told me about two former sisters in his community who had passed on. But there was sort of a story in my book that I write about where a young girl had integrated into a parish in the suburbs of Chicago, and the parents sort of rejected, and she got pushed out of the parish. I never could find out anything that had happened. I'd only sort of knew about it because a young white girl in that parish had written about it and had been horrified what had happened. And yet when he sent me their obituaries, I found the young woman that this happened to. It was Dr. Sharon Glover, excuse me. She had integrated the Servites of Mary when she was 15 years old. And then when she was assigned to the parish, the all-white congregants refused to accept her. They marched against her, and she left religious life, but stayed in the Catholic Church, becomes a major educator, and then reestablishes Black Catholic education in the Archdiocese of Minneapolis. So people stay regardless. I do want to end specifically just with some stories of hope and reparation, again, which I think is one of the great legacies of Black Catholic sisters in the United States. Dr. Patricia Gray, who was Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray, who founded the National Black Sisters Conference, I mentioned that she was the first Black religious sister of mercy. She had not been educated by the Religious Sisters of Mercy. Instead, she had been educated by the Sisters of St. Joseph in Dayton, Pennsylvania, and rejected admission solely on the basis of race. When I was doing a talk in London back in 2015, a member of that community heard me tell that story, and she was horrified that her community had rejected Dr. Gray. And she said, I would have been in the same group as her. And so after we got back to the United States, she reached out and she said, if it's possible, we'd like to go through a formal process of reconciliation with her. And so they did. And in 2018, after the formal reconciliation that they did with Dr. Gray, they brought her to the Mother House, and she met with the women that she would have entered with in 1960 had she not been rejected solely on the basis of race. In the case of the Adrian Dominican sisters in Michigan who have their own history of discrimination and exclusion, a few years ago, they offered $1 million gift as an act of reparation. They gave $500,000 to Xavier University, their Institute for Black Catholic Studies, named after their first Black member who was the head of that institute for several years. And then they gave $500,000 to strengthen the Department of African American Studies and African Studies at Michigan State University as an act. And if you actually go to the website, you'll notice that many of the awards are named after African American sisters and the Black Adrian Dominican sisters. I end in many ways sort of with what I consider to be the legacy or the greatest legacies of the three women who are on the road to canonization within the and it comes through in a quote that was given to me by Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, who was the longtime superior of the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in New York, in Harlem. And I asked her what she thought was the greatest legacy. And she said, and she didn't hesitate, she said, the Catholic Church wouldn't be Catholic if it wasn't for us. We were the people who understood that racism and sexism had no place within the Catholic Church. And that is the greatest legacy that we leave with. We remembered and we always understood that the lives, souls, and futures of Black people mattered. And that's what it means to be truly Catholic, that if all lives matter, then Black lives matter. And I will leave you with that. Thank you.